So this is definitely now not even going to be probably criminal at all.
Okay.
Packing things up, thinking that we're getting pretty close to a conclusion here.
Yeah.
And the doctor calls me back and he says, Dave, you got to come back in here and see this.
Man found dead over a random attack.
About a spike in domestic violence.
Hello, Dave.
Nicole, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you.
Good, good. You got over the fear of our last episode and the boogeyman. He's not haunting you too much?
Not too much.
Okay,
no.
good.
Yeah.
Good to hear. So in a lot of our past episodes, we've kind of talked about the like overarching themes and things that you've really learned in your life as a retired homicide detective, investigator. But now we're kind of going to get a little more technical and find out some skills that you've really learned and how you go about solving a lot of cases. So, you know, a lot of questions like where do you start? Obviously, facts and evidence play a huge role, but
Yes.
it's not always what you might think it is. So there's a lot about instinct, I'm sure, that you have to follow. And then we might talk about too, like how this type of knowledge can be transferred to like the general population and how us as viewers and listeners can really, you know, use this information in our own lives. So walk us through kind of a day in the life.
Yeah, so a day in the life of a death investigator really starts at the same time you hear the report on the news. Right?
Okay.
So you are driving to school, you are driving to work, and you hear that the police are investigating a suspicious death in the city's northwest or southwest or southeast quadrant, and a residence. When that happens, and you hear that report, you know, there's a team of investigators now moving into the office to begin the investigation of that suspicious death. What I find interesting about it though is that when we hear that report, and I would just sort of challenge the listener, the viewer, to think, what does your mind kind of take you to? If you were to hear that, you know, the police are investigating a suspicious death in the city's northwest inside a home, you know, what does your mind kind of prepare you for? For example, Nicole, like, is your victim male or female?
I would just automatically feel like a male.
Male.
Yeah.
And where is the person in the house? I would ask you.
In the living room on the floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, a very natural thing that a lot of people will do, they put the victim in the bedroom, on a bed, or in the living room on a couch. And the other very commonplace is on a kitchen floor. And then there's the questions around, you know, is there a weapon present in your mind's eye? Is there a lot of blood around? You know, these are types of things. You know, likely our naivety around death will in some way sort of influence the imagery that we put into our brain about what this suspicious death is all about.
Yeah, and I'm sure what you've watched and ingested as far as like true crime documentaries
100%.
and stories you've heard about in the news, that sort of thing would probably have an effect too.
Totally.
Yeah.
One of the things that I don't think anybody in their mind, if you do that exercise, is going to come up with right away is, did anybody envision that when you opened up that door, that flies would come pouring out? Right.
Right.
Do we get the sense of smells and all of the other things? The energy, you know, these are all parts of, you know, things that investigators experience when they go out to investigate that death that you've just heard over.
Yeah, all of your senses are affected.
That's right.
Not just what you see.
That's right.
Yeah.
So now you have this investigative team and they're coming out and they're going to start the investigation of suspicious death. What a suspicious death is, to start off with, is a sort of we're not so sure what this might be. And when people die, and we will all one day face that,
Yeah.
we're going to die one of four ways. Naturally, by way of accident, by way of suicide, or by way of homicide. There's no in between there.
Right.
Natural passings would be any kind of a passing through disease, natural,
sleep.
all of those types of things. Accidental deaths, well, there can be a myriad of them, from falling off of a mountain to, car accident, that kind of thing.
Yep.
Suicide, I don't think we need to really go on too much about what that actually is, but, it's when one person takes the life of themselves.
Yep.
And then homicide, when one person takes the life of another person. What's really interesting in the definition of when we deal with investigating death is this. Just because something is a homicide doesn't necessarily mean it is a murder.
I see.
Murder is the legal definition of when a death caused by another person had no justification. And in our country, Canada, and also in the US, there are laws that provide like self-defense laws
Right.
that allow certain actions taken by people that can ultimately justify death.
Yeah, if they feel they were in danger.
Right. So the police, of the 4 ways that people die, the police are most interested in making sure that and only one of them, which is the potential criminal aspect, which is the homicide.
Right.
Once a suspicious death is deemed to be an accident, a natural passing, or a suicide, the police really have no more responsibility to the death itself.
Makes sense.
Sometimes when we investigate death, there is a lingering, and we're going to talk about it later, one particular case for sure, but there can be some ambiguity between if this is actually a homicide or a suicide and an accident.
Right.
And in cases like that, those deaths will be called undetermined deaths.
I see.
In some regions, they might be called unclassified, but they're basically saying, we don't have enough information to label this death one way or the other.
Right.
So this sort of speaks to the process of what we do to investigate death. If you were to draw out in your mind just a triangle, you put at the top of the triangle the word body, one corner of the triangle you put the word scene, and then on the other end of the triangle you put the word history. The police are doing this exact thing. They're doing an examination of the body, the scene, and the history. And all 3 of those things have to come together naturally for us to be able to say, yes, this death is an accident, or yes, this death is a suicide. And if there's ambiguity, then the death will become undetermined. So for example, in cases where somebody dies as a result of drug toxicity,
Right.
more often than not, those deaths will always be determined to be undetermined.
Okay. Because they could be accidental or suicidal.
Exactly.
Right.
Or they could potentially be homicide too.
Yeah.
If the drug was provided.
Yeah.
And so because there may not be enough information to classify it in one of those 4 ways, then it goes automatically undetermined. The one thing we know we can eliminate is natural passing.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But whether it's an accident, suicide, or a homicide, we won't necessarily know.
Yeah, the lines are blurred a little bit.
They
too
are.
much. Yeah.
I had a case a few years ago that I was involved in that was very interesting in terms of how we have to work through this triangle. And I'll kind of give you a little bit of a background. History, before I get into the case, history is really what we learn from witnesses, what we learn from neighbors, what we learn from family members,
Where they were previously in the day.
phone records,
Right.
all of those kinds of things.
Internet history. Yeah.
That's all forms history.
Yeah.
The body, that's going to be the actual physical examination of the body.
Right.
Some of it's done at the scene, but more often than not, it'll be done in a very sterile environment like an autopsy suite.
Right.
And then what the scene itself is saying, or what it potentially is saying, right? Is there forced entry? Is there no forced entry? All of these kinds of things.
Right.
And so you have to, you look at all 3 of those areas to come up with your sort of final, okay, this is what it might be. And if it turns out to be a homicide, by going through this process, 2 other things will actually probably reveal themselves to you. the motive or the why,
Yeah.
and the who. Because hidden behind one of those sort of three corners of the pyramid will be the who in a homicide investigation.
Right.
It'll either be somebody in the person's history,
Yeah.
more times than not.
Yeah.
It might be evidence that you collect from the scene, like fingerprint or DNA or something like that, that will identify the who. Or it could be something collected on the body itself
Right.
that could identify the who. But the who is probably hidden behind one of those.
Somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I find also very interesting.
Yeah.
This case that I was thinking of, though, that where we kind of go through this natural progression, it starts very simply. It was a very, very cold January. And it involved a family that had a young granddaughter, elderly grandparents. And whenever the grandkids came over to visit, they would send their grandchildren to the detached garage at sort of the back of the property to go and take the recycling out.
Okay.
And so on this particular day, one of the grandchildren has come to visit Grandma and Grandpa, and as one of their chores, is Grandma and Grandpa give them, is to go take these cans out to the garage, which they no longer have access to just because of mobility and age.
Right. So they might not have been in the garage for some time.
Almost 12 days.
Okay. Okay.
So-
I have a feeling she's going to find something.
Yes, she does. So
Okay.
she opens up that garage door to go put those cans and bottles, and there's a man laying on the garage floor that she does not know. He does
Okay.
not belong to the home,
Deceased.
deceased.
Okay.
And blood in a number of different areas. And actually also evidence of this individual living in the garage.
Okay.
There's been a makeshift shelter made out of a workbench and some blankets.
Oh.
There's a couple areas in the garage where the person has used the washroom.
Okay.
And that individual, when you look at his body at scene, has a large gash on the head,
Okay.
and there's no weapon present.
Okay.
And the large gash on the head actually looks like a knife wound. So right
No
away,
knife present.
no knife present.
Okay. I
And
feel like I'm playing a game of Clue as I'm trying
totally
to piece this together. See if you can figure it out too. As
So
the
this is
listener.
this is what we did. You know, I went out to the scene, I looked, and I'm like, okay, well, with the medical examiner, they're very, very specialized. We look at it, we go, you know what, we can't explain that. And that looks like a knife wound.
Right.
Let's call in the team. So that's what happens. The team gets called in, and we begin the investigation into a homicide.
Yeah.
Okay? Makes sense based on what we've seen at the scene.
Yeah.
Once we get the victim identified in this case, though, something really interesting plays out. In his history, we find out about 12 days earlier, he had been at a house party. And in this house party, he had been involved in a knife fight with another person inside the party.
Okay.
And during this,
That had been reported.
it had been
We're
reported.
aware of that. Okay.
And the other person in this story had actually been stabbed multiple times.
Okay.
Many, many times, and was transported to the hospital in life-threatening condition. And in the house party in the story, according to witnesses, our victim, who's now deceased in the garage, was also stabbed once in the head,
Okay.
which is what we see.
Yeah.
So we now know we definitely have a homicide, but based on some of the circumstances that occurred 12 days
Was it
earlier,
self-defense?
potentially.
Yeah.
So we may have a homicide, but it might not be culpable, meaning that there may not be, it may not be criminal in nature. But it's certainly something of interest to police, and the police are going to have to investigate,
Yeah.
right? So as our investigation sort of continues, it carries over into the next day, and at the next day we go to autopsy. And at autopsy, I'm there, and the medical examiner says to me, Dave, we've got a really, really interesting situation here. I'm like, well, what's that? He said, you know that laceration in the top of the head? I said, yeah. He goes, well, that's not the cause of death.
Really?
Yeah, it's just a laceration. It's a knife wound,
Yeah.
but it didn't cause his death.
Okay.
We need to look further. And so looking for further means going internally into the body to look for those clues and that evidence. And in so doing, the medical examiner comes across some things in the victims, comes across evidence that the victim had died or potentially had frozen to death.
Okay.
So now this is no longer a homicide to a non-culpable homicide. This is looking more and more like a natural passing. Hypothermia is a
Froze.
natural.
Right.
Yeah, is a natural passing. And it's evidenced by literally these little ulcers that you find in the stomach
Okay.
of people that have died as a result of hypothermia.
And that was present.
They're present. So this is definitely now not even going to be probably criminal at all.
Okay.
Packing things up, thinking that we're getting pretty close to a conclusion here.
Yeah.
And the doctor calls me back and he says, Dave, you got to come back in here and see this. I said, okay. They had gone a little bit further into the examination and had removed 3 bags, condoms, full of fentanyl. But 2 of them had broken.
Like in his digestional.
In his digestive, yeah.
Okay.
But 2 had already broken.
2 had broken. Wow.
Turns out this is a drug toxicity.
Uh-huh.
And it's an accidental death.
Okay.
The twists and turns of the
Wow.
evidence triangle.
Yes. Yes.
But it was following the evidence and the facts as they kind of came up and not making a lot of theories off at the very beginning.
not off the top. Yeah. Or
that-
assumptions.
Right. That ultimately resolve this and classify this death as a accidental drug overdose.
Right.
And it all makes sense. You know, even the flight away from the home after the initial stabbing, looking for a place on a cold January to kind of lay down and bed for a little bit to get away from the cops that are probably coming to the original incident.
Right.
And then ingesting the drug, likely because he doesn't want to be caught with it. And then realizing that he's actually getting sick from the ingestion of the drug,
Right.
and then doing his very, very best to void his body of the drug, which is
Right.
evidenced inside the garage.
Ballot that he had gone to the washroom.
Yeah.
I see. Wow.
So this all kind of starts to fit.
Yes.
And that is what a death investigation is all about.
Wow.
But you need to have all of those pieces coming together. It's like
Yes.
it's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together.
Yeah, and I would imagine, like, are there, I mean, obviously the facts are there, but are there often different opinions within the team as to, like, which way to look, or if you disagree on something? Like, can you talk a little bit about that angle of it?
Like this. I mean, certainly, you know, everybody will have an opinion at different points.
Yeah.
But I think actually, for the most part, with the
facts
exception of,
driven.
yeah, it's facts driven. You know, I think that the one of the takeaways of this episode, and what I hope people will take from it is just because it appears to be one thing, it doesn't matter what it is, you know, whether it's a death or something else, it's not always what it appears to be.
Right.
And it is facts and evidence, not theories and rumors that solve these things. You know, if we relied it all on theory, for example, or rumor, that's where like things like miscarriages of justice occur.
Yeah, yeah.
So it has to be a process just like this, you know?
Yeah, and on that note, like, how do you think the general population can kind of use those tools that maybe something isn't always as it appears to be.
Right.
So, like, how would you kind of transfer that knowledge now that you're on the other side of it?
Yeah, so I think the way to transfer it is to like look at what you believe to be true and source out how you believe it to be true. Right? I mean, it is following what evidence actually supports that.
Yeah.
Right? Is it something you heard at the water cooler and now you're just taking it in as gospel?
Right.
Or is there some actual proof to whatever the assertion is? You know, and we're living in a world now, it's very interesting. This world that we're living in now, even like artificial intelligence, it's creating sets of facts, putting them out. It's getting harder and harder.
Yeah.
Even know what's true and what's not true.
Well, even with social media,
That's
how
right.
so many people post the best versions of themselves, the best days of their lives. Like, you know, I'm guilty of it too, only because I'm like, well, I feel like this
Yeah.
is somewhere that I can go back and I can relive this trip or whatever it is. So I do tend to just post the positive. But I know that can be very dangerous for those who are kind of like wallowing in a whole other world of negativity, that you're always being, you know, presented with other people's quote unquote perfect lives.
Right.
But it's not always as it appears.
It's not always as it
Yeah.
appears. And I think that, you know, I always just sort of think to myself now, if I learned something, I'd like to know how I learned it.
Right.
I try to source it back. And that is the process of a professional death investigation too.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it is, okay, I believe this to be true, but how do I how is it proved through evidence, right? And sometimes when you go through that process, like it did with me in this example, I was tricked multiple times. But as new information came in and new evidence came in, focus has changed. I think that's the other part of it, is staying adaptable, like accepting. We'll talk a little bit more about like how absolutes,
Right. Yeah.
you know,
Discretionary things. Yeah.
yeah, like absolutes are not always certain. And we can't just say, yeah, this is this, because there can be a twist or a turn that we don't see coming that ultimately, you know, doesn't allow the truth to reveal itself to us.
Right. Right.
And if we had just stopped and made every assessment just based on the scene itself and ignored any of those other 2 points of the triangle, think about how wrong we would have been.
Right. Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And so interesting.
And I'm sure in investigating death, because you've seen so much of it, does it also bring you kind of an awareness that, you know, today is obviously so important, treat every day as your last, like that kind of thing,
Yeah.
because it was kind of in your face for all those years. Like, what's your take on living in the present moment and all of that?
I mean, totally. I think like when you investigate death, you realize how fragile death is, or how fragile life is.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And something that I think the dead always taught me, you know, was as I was a steward of their investigation, was that, you know, tomorrow was not promised to anybody. If you think it is, you're wrong. And, you know, I have a perfect case in point. It was a girl who moved to our city from a larger center of east. And when she arrived here, she was pursuing a public relations career.
Okay.
Young, you know, full of energy, full of life, had gone out one night to the bar with her friends. And at 2:00 in the morning, as everybody is doing, they are all kind of gathered outside the bar saying their final goodnights.
Last call. Yeah. Everybody go home.
Yeah. The hugs and,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And some dummy in the crowd who had a gun and wanted to show off for the group decided that he was going to, you know, pull that gun from his waistband, point it up in the air, and start shooting rounds off. Completely careless, completely reckless, but he's shooting it into the air. And then, for whatever reason, he decided to level the gun into the crowd of people standing out front, and he fired 3 more times, and one of those bullets had eyes for this, like I say, just really wonderful, by all accounts, person. Struck her in the chest, and she died instantly out front of this nightclub. Going through this process with, you know, figuring out how she died, that was really easy. It was witnessed.
Right. There were a lot
know.
of people there, and
You know, it was
Yeah.
obvious it was a homicide right from the beginning. It was obvious it was a murder right from the beginning. There was no justification for why this happened.
right.
Right. But, and so we were called in immediately and began our process. And part of that process is meeting with family. And I remember the first day I met her mom, you know, she flew out, you know, she was here within 24 hours she was here.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Because she
sitting
wasn't
with-
living in
No.
the city. Okay.
And sitting with her and just listening to the story of our victim and listening to her history and how, you know, how forward she was in her life. Like, she definitely had a passion. She was delivering on that passion. She was
Yeah.
here to do what and that to have this happen to her was horrible.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I always remember about meeting with Mom too was how much she believed, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happens to us when we die
Okay.
later.
Yeah.
And maybe the role of faith a little bit.
Right.
But how much this mom fell back on that.
Right.
That this was actually fate. That this
yeah.
was, in her belief,
This
was
was
God.
how her story was
Yeah.
going to end.
This was, in her belief, God's
Wow.
decision. And it made her coping with the death piece easier.
Yeah.
But it speaks to, I think, a big part of when it comes to investigating death, you are also working for the living still.
Yes.
And I think that that's something we always have to keep in mind.
Right. That life of service transcends
That's right.
obviously past the investigation.
That's right.
It's the families.
That's right.
Yeah. And a big reason why you were such a big advocate, because that was so important to you too.
It was, but
to
I mean,
bring some sort of peace. Yeah.
well, that with that comes a lot of things.
Yeah.
Some of it is sometimes in this case, her having a very clear understanding of what happened.
Yeah.
She had the grace to actually forgive.
Wow.
And
And that takes a lot of that mental maturity that
so
we
much.
talked about as well, right? Because it's not easy to
No.
just accept it
Yeah.
as that. But like you said, I think it is a way to really kind of cope with the tragedy that has happened.
I agree.
Yeah, yeah. So as you mentioned, we will be talking more about what happens when you die.
Yeah.
Actually, in one of our upcoming episodes, and also just on potential afterlife of sorts. And
Yeah.
we might have some stories to share about that as well.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, Dave, for shedding some light on the technical process of investigating a death. I think that was so interesting. Looking forward to the next one.
Looking forward, Nicole.
All right, thank you. Well, we hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Ride Along. And if you're interested in learning more about Dave's career and the lessons he learned throughout, now that he's on the other side of it, be sure to pick up a copy of his book that he co-wrote with Sarah Cades called Skeletons in My Closet. And keep an eye out for his new release, Undaunted, with Susan Forrest.
My mantra of leaving people better than you found them continues to be my driver. And I hope you're leaving this podcast today feeling inspired, informed, and inclined to live your dash. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe. And take care, everybody. Thanks for joining us on The Ride Along.